All right, we are recording. Away we go. And let's see. Yeah, so you guys have both microphones are unmuted, correct? Okay, so they should be good for the recording. Okay. If I want to do a little bit more like an official service kind of thing for a message, you start with a question or something like I've been doing, right? So I could ask a question. We already talked about Nathan's recently, so we don't want to talk about Nathan's or Caleb's we talked about recently too. Can some of you tell me what your name means? Yep, Michael, one who is like God or something like that. Yep. Anybody else know what their name means? Betsy? Consecrated to God. Betsy. Oh, gotcha. Elizabeth, is it? Okay, so Betsy is a derivative of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is consecrated to God. Yeah. Does it seem like our culture used to pay more attention to the meanings of names than they do these days? Yeah, no, made up names. Oh, wait, were all names made up at some point? uh, well, one of the things that is a feature of Isaiah, especially where we're starting tonight, is this reality that names have meanings. And again, as I'm going to do every week, if I remember, is say on video to attribute necessarily, I'm working on the study materials from one of my seminary classes that was taught by Professor David Needham. This is his seminary notes on the book of Isaiah that I'm sharing with our congregation. So I'm just doing my best to relate those things. So this next section runs from chapter 7 all the way through the end of chapter 12 is the section that he takes next. At least through 11. I think, though, it goes all the way through 12. Yeah, it gets into 12 also. So there's a particular flow in a section here of 7 through 12, and he calls this section Emmanuel. God with us is really the key identifier of sections of this section of chapter 7 to 12. So here was his introduction. He says, in contrast with Old Testament Jewish culture, our culture attaches very little importance to the meanings of people's names. Yet when we come to these chapters, names and their meanings become the key to unlock the flow of Isaiah's thought. Remember, it's always a little challenging to figure out the flow in the book of Isaiah. We talk about symphonic progression. Well, here in this small section, 7 through 12, the meanings of names become a key to unlocking the flow. So he's going to look at a number of names in these sections. So let's see here. He's starting out with this idea of the overall flow of the chapters. We're not going to do all this tonight. I wanted to give you the overview, though. So he covers a look of the overall flow of 7 through 12. Then he covers the messianic promises in 7 through 12. And then he has a section called Gaining a Perspective on Isaiah 7 through 12. And a couple of historical bridges from 7 through 12. And then it gets to the next section. Chapters 13 through 23 are his next major section, which is called the oracles against a number of nations: Jerusalem, Edom, Tyre, Damascus, Philistia, Moab, Babylon. So that's the next big section, is the oracles, and we are just now starting a brand new big section. We saw this flashback, Isaiah's call, chapter 6, and now we're on Emmanuel, 7 through 12. Okay. So if your Bibles are open, take a look at the way it starts. It's a historical statement, things going on. In the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, so we're dealing with the kingdom of Judah, again, we're reminded of that, Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not yet mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told, quote, Syria is in league with Ephraim, that's another term that just means the people of God, Israelites, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. And the Lord said to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jashub your son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field, and say to him, be careful, be quiet, do not fear, do not let your heart be faint because of these two smoldering stumps of firebrands, of the fierce anger of Rezin and Syria and the son of Remaliah. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, the head of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria. The head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. Yeah, that's just the first 9 verses of 7. So that's the historical setting that we see. Isaiah is on his way out to meet King Ahaz. But Isaiah is not alone. Tagging along at his side is his young son with quite a significant name, Shear-Jashub. Some of your Bibles may have a note on that. It means a remnant shall return. A remnant shall return. That's Shear-Jashub's name. That's what it meant. Turn over to chapter 8 for a moment. And Andrew, since you got the microphone, if you want to read first. Read chapter 8, verse 18 for us. You'll have to unmute it, I think.
Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion.
So Isaiah says, I, myself, and my sons, he says there, are a sign from the Lord and portents in Israel. Okay, that's interesting. So this kid was named a remnant shall return, Shear-Jashub. So keep in mind that this boy was to be a sign, kind of a bad news, good news sign to Ahaz. And it's a sign that wicked Ahaz was not a good king. Judah had some good kings that were fairly godly. Ahaz was not one of them. This is a sign that Ahaz would not want a remnant shall return. This sign, the name of this kid, come along with Isaiah, is Shear-Jashub, a remnant shall return. Why is that not a good sign? Yeah, you have to go in order to return. The people have to be taken away in order to have something somewhere to return from. It was a sign of conquest. So it's a good news, bad news. The good news is a remnant will come back. What do you mean a remnant will come back? Well, I mean they're going to go away. They're going to get conquered. But a remnant will return. So it's not really a particularly good message, this boy and his name and this meaning that he's meant to be a sign to herald these things. So yes, the people were going to be carried away. There's an implication they'll be carried away into captivity. That was the last thing that King Ahaz desired. So he's being threatened by two fairly small countries, Syria and the own people of Israel. The other 10 tribes are the nation of Israel. So their own brothers, so to speak, in the family of God, or the nation of God, the Jewish people, the Israelite people, God's chosen people, Judah and, isn't it Benjamin? Are in Judah, and the other 10 tribes are in the nation of Israel. And these two nations, Israel, their own brothers, so to speak, and the kingdom of Syria, which was fairly small, are threatening Israel. And you could hear when I read it that Ahaz was, the heart of his people shook as the trees. The heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook like trees before the wind. That was in verse 2 of chapter 7. They feel very threatened by these two fairly small nations. Ahaz didn't want to be defeated. And then the next thing we hear, so to speak, is Isaiah promising this king another sign, another boy with the name Emmanuel, which means what? God with us. And this sign was one of hope. And this is over in, as you know, so there's a son named Shear-Jashub. That has meaning. You look over in chapter 7, then verse 14. And then we know this from Christmas time. Therefore, well, let's have Lydia read it. Next, Mike, reader. Read 14 for a second. 7:14.
Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel.
Go ahead and just send that down to Caleb if you want, because we'll have him read next probably. We'll just keep it moving. So he says, the professor in the note says, the very next thing you hear this. Well, there's other stuff in between. We read those other verses, but like kind of looking at the event and the things that are happening and what Isaiah is setting out. So Shear-Jashub, a remnant will return. That means you're going to get carried away in defeat. But then we hear Isaiah promising that there would be this other boy with the name Emmanuel, meaning God with us. This was a sign of hope. And there's a hope then, then my enemies will be defeated. I mean, there's a hope for that these two enemies would be defeated. Now, of course, we know that chapter 7:14 would be fulfilled by the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, right? This is a messianic prophecy very clearly. We take it that way for good reason. But then he says, but wait a moment. The sign, when you look at 7:14, the sign isn't just verse 14. The sign goes through verse 16 is the sign. So we keep on reading. Caleb, would you read verse 15 and 16 then? So we heard, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And it keeps on talking. It says, what next?
He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste.
It even looks like the statement from God continues even on beyond that. But let's stop there. Because it continues to talk about what will happen. The Lord will bring upon you, upon your people, etc., etc. But stopping there for a moment. So this was a sign to Ahaz initially. Emmanuel, God with us, this next boy's name, but then there's this other statement about the life of this boy before he's even old enough to know how to refuse evil and choose good. These two nations are going to be defeated, he says. So verse 16 sounds as though there must have been some baby born in these times. Was there another virgin birth? Another born son from a virgin besides Jesus way back then? We'll get to this later, not tonight. The word Alma, which means young woman or virgin, we're going to talk about that. We're going to consider that when we come back. Now, the next thing that happens then in chapter 7, verses 17 through 25, Isaiah tells Ahaz of this dreadful invasion by Assyria. And you can see that it starts with that in 17. Nathan, why don't you read verse 17 for us?
The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria.
And it talks about that for quite a few verses to come. It goes through 25. So Isaiah tells Ahaz that the dreadful invasion by Assyria will come not only upon the northern kingdom, God's people, but also against the southern kingdom, God's people. Now, I was a little confused by this when I was studying it, because usually, we hear about, God brought the promised people to the promised land. The land doing what? Flowing with what? Milk and honey. Well, this is a statement of great abundance and having much wealth in the land of food and other things. And so I'm a little confused because I think this is judgment, but then it says that he will eat curds and honey up in verse 15. And I'm thinking that's a good statement, but they were saying, no, that's not a good statement. Curds and honey were what you ate when you didn't have hardly anything left of the normal produce of the land. If you have a goat, you can make a little bit of yogurt. That's curds. And honey, you can just find it in the wild. So even though a land flowing with milk and honey speaks of bountiful abundance of produce in a land, here it's a picture of lack in the land because of the oppressions of the Assyrian invaders. So that's a bad thing, evidently, that only had curds and honey. So in this context, talking about the invasion of the Assyrians into both the northern and southern kingdoms, the curds and honey the baby would eat are mentioned as the diet of those who lived in their ravaged land. The real danger to Judah was Assyria. Judah was afraid of Israel and Syria, but they were nothing compared to the big problem. The big problem was the nation of Assyria, which is kind of an ironic twist, our professor said, because Ahaz had tried to make a bargain with Assyria. They tried to make a treaty with Assyria to protect themselves because he didn't want to get attacked by Syria and Israel. But Assyria, who he made a treaty with or tried to, was the real threat, the one who would really come against the nation. It talks about this in, he had turned to them for help. He had hired Assyria to deliver him from Syria and Israel. Next reader, Iva, if you would read 7 verse 20. Nathan, you got the microphone there for her? 7:20.
I have to find it. In that day, the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the river, the king of Assyria, to shave your head and the hair of your legs, and to take off your beards also.
So it calls Assyria a razor that is hired beyond the river. And I guess I didn't look into this in depth, but I think you could go to the historical books, whichever book it's in, 1st or 2nd Kings or Chronicles, wherever it's at. It's 1st or 2nd Samuel, probably Kings or Chronicles. Anyway, it talks about Ahaz trying to make a treaty with him, I think. But Assyria is the ones that would ultimately bring him to the edge of destruction. And it talks about this destruction in 17 through 19. Tammy, do you want to read those for us? And the microphone's there to your right. Well, actually, why don't you just read? Well, I've read 20 already, and this is right before 20 though. Yeah, 17, 18, and 19.
And the Lord shall bring upon thee and upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. And it shall come to pass that in the day that the Lord shall hiss for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they shall come, and they shall rest all of them in the desolate valleys, and in the holes of the rocks, and upon all thorns, and upon all bushes.
And then there's the verse that I've read about they'll be shaving them all. And then if you guys turn over and you can pass the mic back to Mike, there's another statement of this kind of the destruction in chapter 8, verses 7 and 8, if you want to read that for us. 8, 7, and 8.
Now therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong and abundant waters of the Euphrates, even the king of Assyria and all his glory. And it will rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks. Then it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through. It will reach even to the neck, and the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel.
So again, it would come against Israel, but would even affect Judah as well. Now then, so we've looked at this boy named Shir-Jashub. We've looked at the boy named Emmanuel. The next boy we come across has one of the craziest names in all of Scripture. He's called Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. How would you like to have a name like that? Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. We find him in chapter 8. Betsy, would you read, just verse 1, I guess just 1 for us. That's where it comes up initially.
Are you saying the 8 chapter?
Chapter 8, verse 1, sorry, yep.
No, that's okay. Then the Lord said to me, take for yourself a large tablet and write on it in ordinary letters, swift is the booty, speedy is the prey.
which is the translation of Meir Shalal Hashbaz. Now read verse 3 also, Betsy.
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to make me pronounce that. So I approached the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. Then the Lord said to me, name him Meir Shalal Hashbaz.
Yeah, that's the one. Which means, as you said, quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. Quite a name for a baby. Now, this is Isaiah, unless other children are being left out. This is the second son, the second child born to Isaiah, the second son that he fathered. The immediate sign value of his name pointed to the encouraging promise that the spoils, remember it said, quick to the plunder, swift to the spoils, the riches of the two small countries. So this is kind of a help to Ahaz, so to speak, that this nation is coming. Assyria, they're quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. The immediate sign value pointed to the encouraging promise that the spoils or riches of the two small countries threatening Judah, Israel and Syria, would be carried off by Assyria. In other words, Judah doesn't need to fear those two countries. Much to our surprise, the timing and the historical circumstances surrounding this boy's birth, 8:4, before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the kings of Assyria. That's the next verse after what Betsy read. So the timing and historical circumstances surrounding this boy's birth sound virtually identical with that of the baby in 7:14, the one called Emmanuel, right? So he poses this question: could this son of Isaiah, Meir Shalal Hashbaz, actually be the sign baby of 7:14 through 16, the Emmanuel? But this baby wasn't virgin born, chapter 8, verse 3. He says, we know for sure that 7:14 pointed ahead to Christ as the fulfillment in view of what Matthew would write, but could there have been some sort of double fulfillment? Well, yeah, there could. This is what happens in these prophetic things sometimes. There's double fulfillment. So can Emmanuel in 7:14 be referring to Christ? And could it also be referring to another child? Because remember, the sign wasn't just verse 14. It was 14, it was 15, it was 16. And it talks about this boy when he's eating these things, and before he's old enough to know these things, these two kings will be dealt with. It sounds like there's a dual fulfillment or a double fulfillment. There's immediate fulfillment that took place in the short term, but this is also a messianic prophecy that wouldn't be fulfilled for a long time yet, till Christ would come. Kind of curious how God weaves these things together. And we are not going to get through all this tonight, but let's keep moving. I got a little break point coming up here, maybe. We'll see. And then we'll just talk some about this too. Okay, so picking up our story, chapter 8, verse 5. Isaiah begins to describe then this Syrian invasion, this flood. We read that a little bit. Mike, you'd read those, that this water, the idea of a river overspilling its banks and causing destruction is there in the early part of chapter 8. So we have this described, and it's kind of like this flood in verse 8 we kind of see. This flood that breaks out. It will sweep on into Judah, it will overflow and pass on, reaching even up to the neck, like this water is really running deep. And Isaiah's response is kind of interesting. It's kind of like, yeah, go ahead, do your worst. Andrea, go read 9 and 10 for us. Here's Isaiah's response to this flood of destruction from Assyria.
Be broken, you peoples, and be shattered. Give ear, all you far countries. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Speak a word, but it will not stand, for God is with us.
So that's kind of Isaiah's response. He knows about this. He sees him coming, but he throws out there, yeah, go ahead, do your worst. God's going to get you, or whatever, kind of ideas are there. You're going to get yours too. And this idea of Emmanuel, God is with us. In fact, that's what it says here at the end of what you read, Mike, in 8. Oh, Emmanuel, the remembrance that God is with us. So yeah, you're going to overflow your banks and cause all these problems, but we remember Emmanuel, God with us. So be broken, you peoples, be shattered, and whatever you want to have, it's not going to work out because God is with us. So that's, again, the statement Emmanuel that it ends with in 10. And then we look at verse 12 and on. I mean, I know 11 is the next verse, but looking at 12 through 22, God gives some very personal words to Isaiah. It says in verse 11, "For the Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, saying," and God gives this long statement in 12 through 22. It's words of trust for Isaiah and terror for the people who turn from God to Spiritism. Should be very afraid of that. God then promises that someday, out of the darkness and distress, the people will see a great light. And that really comes in 9, right? Verse 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, and we know that that's messianic again. So yes, someday wars would end. Verses 4 and 5 kind of talk about wars ending. And then this other baby is mentioned in a sense again, because Emmanuel, again, this other child, verse 6. Go ahead, Lydia. You read the other child one. Read this one too. 9 verse 6, yep. Come back to another child, but the same one as we read the second child's name, Emmanuel.
For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
So again, up in 2, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them a light is shone. And we get down to 6 and we see that really linked to this great light, a child is going to be born, a very important, a most important child. Now his name is quite lengthy here. It sounds like descriptions, but these are really names also. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now you could say for Everlasting Father, Father of Eternity. So yes, a kingdom forever. And this promise comes after a time of victory over the enemy, a time of spoils divided, or Meir Shalal Hashbaz. So that's kind of the first section here. I don't know if we're even going to get any farther. It's already 5 till. So it's really, I guess, only 3 names in a sense, or you could say more because of all the compound names. So interesting stuff going on with these names. Shir Jashub, Emmanuel, Meir Shalal Hashbaz, and then Emmanuel again, but described as Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Reflections, thoughts, send the mic around as you need to or want to. Other passages that come to mind. Let's take a break from me talking and see if somebody wants to chime in on anything here.
I was just noticing in verse 8, chapter 8, and the spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Who's it referring to?
I would guess Assyria?
O Emmanuel?
Well, no, the O Emmanuel. Is that then, let's see.
Is that Israel? Is that?
Well, I wonder if it could be Israel. Here's a note from my study Bible. Because of the Assyrian onslaught, the land of Emmanuel, okay, they're using it as a synonym for Israel.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, good point. The land of Emmanuel was to be stripped of all its earthly glory. Yeah, I don't remember that. Good catch. So we talk about, Ephraim. Sometimes it just stands for Israel, or Israel. Judah, or others just stand for Israel altogether. There's a few others. Naphtali, I think, is used sometimes to just speak of God. But evidently, yeah, so is Emmanuel. Yeah, interesting. Hadn't realized that. He doesn't bring that out in the notes. I'm sure he knows. He's with the Lord now. His study of Isaiah is growing to new heights, I'm sure. Yeah, that's interesting. Other thoughts? by the way, just a little bit of a spoiler, and we can talk about anything else you guys want, but this whole idea with the kids being born Shear-Jashub, and then Mer-Shalal-Hashbaz, the thing with the virgin will conceive and all these things. There's a lot of stuff here, but they speculate that perhaps his wife died in birth with Shear-Jashub, and he married again, younger woman. I don't know how much younger, but so a young woman, Alma, will conceive and give birth to a son. We'll talk about that another time, but that's one of the things I hadn't remembered from seminary days, which was a long time ago, but like, okay, so they speculate about perhaps a second wife that birthed Mer-Shalal-Hashbaz.
Well, isn't the word mean maiden, basically, young maiden?
Yeah, we'll do.
In the context in the Old Testament, doesn't necessarily imply virgin, but Matthew, in the application of that word, when it carries it across, is specifically speaking of a virgin.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, we have actually, and I may use it, a whole page that he goes into just the idea of the young woman, virgin, all this kind of stuff, and what we could know about that. Because there's some really interesting stuff. Like I say, we don't have time tonight, but the parallels between Mer-Shalal-Hashbaz and Emmanuel it's almost exactly the same wordings. They're used for those two little boys. So we'll come back to that because the professor really feels that Mer-Shalal-Hashbaz and Emmanuel are the same baby. And then dual fulfillment, Emmanuel is also Jesus Christ born later. And how you can understand that with virgin versus young woman or maiden, all these things. Yeah, quite interesting. Other thoughts? If not on the passages, I didn't give you a whole lot of time there, but if not on the passage, what I really like is, like we did last week, tell me how this affects you personally. Is there what here was an encouragement to you, or a challenge to you? I mean, we're just reading about these funny prophecies and names of kids, but God doesn't just mean this to be of no use to us spiritually. What's the value of these chapters we looked at tonight? What do you think? And we'll get the microphone to you. How do you feel after hearing these things? What do you think about God? Anyone? Andrea.
So I guess for me, the verses that stand out, we looked at them just a little bit, is in chapter 8, verse 12. Do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling. And it goes on to talk about that. But just the idea that there's so much in the world to fear, whether it's conquering kingdoms or famine or drought or, whatever the things that these people would be afraid of or things that we might be afraid of now. But ultimately it comes down to we should not be afraid of those things. We should be in fear of God and to know that he will take care of everything. And those things may come upon us, but if we're trusting in God, he will carry us through and he will be our help.
And that was in 1 Peter recently too, right? Was it just last week we were talking about that again? Out of 1 Peter 4, that don't fear them. They can't ultimately do anything to you. Fear God. Yeah. So that's another great way to kind of work off a text as we finish the notes and just look to you guys is other verses. I mean, there's stuff we didn't read in there tonight in 7 and 8. Other verses that catch your attention, concepts. That was a really good catch there, Andrea. Good to see that statement because that's powerful. And doesn't that sound messianic too? Isn't it Jesus talked of that way? A stone of offense, a rock of stumbling. And many shall stumble on it. They shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken. Isn't that almost exactly what we hear about Jesus? So other thoughts out of 7 or 8 primarily. Here you go, Nathan.
It's not much exactly, but just before the part about those in darkness seeing a great light, the 9:1.
Okay.
Just a bit about in the future he'll honor Galilee of the Gentiles by the way of the sea along the Jordan. And of course you immediately think of all those things Jesus did around the Sea of Galilee when he did come, and also
Yeah, good point.
Wondering how the original audience would have thought of that, honor Galilee of the Gentiles, them, that place. All know they, most of them didn't really like Gentiles that much, and yet, again, like so many other places, it talks about in the Old Testament mentioning God's plans for the Gentiles too, even if it wasn't fully revealed yet the way it is in the New Testament.
Yeah. Yours uses the word Gentiles instead of nations. Galilee of the Gentiles. ESV, yeah, is that right? Good, yeah. And yours is NIV? Yeah, my ESV says of the nations. It's an interesting distinction if it's referring to particularly the Gentiles. Because, again, the idea that the Gentiles would someday be grafted in was this huge, really a mystery, Paul calls it, doesn't he? Okay. NAS also has Gentiles, yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting stuff that would just kind of, we pass over it in getting these overviews, but there's some really good stuff in there. Thank you for bringing that up, Nathan. Others? Boy, I have a whole section in my Bible called Isaiah Fulfilled at Christ's First Coming. Fulfilled literally and fulfilled typically. It's got two sections here. That's an interesting chart. Yeah, so some of the things were a type of Christ and other things literally fulfilled of Christ. Yeah, it mentions the rock one. It's like the fact that the virgin birth of Christ, that's a reference from 7:14. That was fulfilled literally. But 8:14 and 15, the one about stone of stumbling, rock of offense, that was fulfilled by Christ he was a type of those things. The stone of stumbling, rock of offense is in Romans 9:33 and 1 Peter 2:8. Yeah. Study Bibles have some cool stuff sometimes. Other thoughts or comments? Reflections? Caleb.
I guess just with emphasis on the names and the meanings, I just had a thought that, I guess just as a small perspective thing, that God has a very active role in our lives, and he doesn't just bring us into this world on a whim, and like we're, like I know you and Mom put a lot of thought into our names and didn't just choose one on a whim, and just because we don't have a name like Mayor Shala Haspaz, we can do great things. So.
Yes.
Just
Would you rather have been named Mayor Shala Hashbaz? You're pretty content with Caleb Michael. Yeah, it's interesting. Nathan?
Yeah, and that comment reminds me, how some commentators talk about the importance of how, God names other things too, like, sort of saying how God telling them to name these kids specific things, he had something very particular in mind that in that sense sort of involved his sons. And he changed Abram's name to Abraham, he gave Jacob the name Israel, he did so many other instances of things like that where God showed his involvement and his concern and his purpose for people in the naming and renaming all that sort of thing.
Yeah, good point. And Sarai became Sarah. Saul became Paul. Are there others? Those are significant. Mike?
Yeah, I was just struck a little bit again, maybe, and we've already been talked about a little bit, but the fact that God directed Isaiah to name his children specific things that indicated exactly what was going to take place. And it was like the name, set it in concrete, set it in stone.
This will happen.
It's not like you're going to change the kid's name if it doesn't work out. It's like, this is the way it's going to be. Name your son, and it will happen. It's just pretty profound.
Yeah. Okay, so who else is named? John the Baptist? God gave him that name, right? Is that specified in there? Samson, is Samson given a name? They're just told that the child would be a Nazarite from birth, etc., etc. Trying to remember if Samson, I don't think they gave the parents the name Samson. Could be wrong. But didn't God tell them to name John John?
Right, and the whole thing with they wanted to name after his dad, his
Yeah.
father, and yeah, they won some of the other families saying, "Oh, aren't you gonna name him after yourself or his father or whatever?" And he was still couldn't speak because he doubted the angel told him about John, and he wrote down that his name will be John or something like that.
And then finally he could speak.
Right.
Yeah.
He's agreeing with what the angel had told him. No, it has to be John.
Mm-hmm. What does John mean? Okay, like Nathaniel, gift of God. Yeah. Matthew. Weren't you saying that earlier today? Like half the names in the world mean gift of God or something. Yeah. All right. Any other comments? Ready to be done? Oh, Mom. Yeah, sorry. Andrea, I shouldn't say Mom to the video. Andrea, my wife.
I just think as we talking about what Mike had mentioned, it was going to happen. God said it, and he had planned it, and it was going to happen. And yet, we as people can be so stubborn, and we can rebel against God. And in verse 21, it talks about that. They'll go through the land greatly distressed and hungry. And when they are hungry, instead of turning to God, they will be enraged and will speak contemptuously against their king and their God and turn their faces upward, and they will look to the earth. But behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. And it reminds me of some of the verses in Revelation where it talks about, Christ is going to return, and all these terrible things are going to happen, and people will know that it is Christ and it is God, and they will know that they should turn, they should repent, and they should follow God, but instead they will curse him. They will, in their stubbornness and in their arrogance, they will curse God and try to hide from him or try to fight him or whatever. But it's not possible. What God says is going to happen, and we cannot change that. We can't fight against God and win. And yet there's something about the human soul that, again, is just so prideful and so arrogant that many, many people will not turn and will not repent, and they will be thrust into darkness.
Yeah, they ultimately just curse God. They set themselves up and hold themselves up against God, and that never ends well. Yep.
Like Job's wife's counsel.
When Job's wife said, curse God and die. Well, that's literally what's going to happen to people. Yeah. It was an interesting statement. So usually you think of turning your face upward as a positive thing that was in that passage, but it's not. I think it's the opposite of reverence, where you bow down. Instead, you're turning your face up, and I think that's their defiance. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Any other comments on the passage? Another microphone? Hang on. Oh, no, it needs to be on the microphone. We want to hear what you have to say.
Not much.
Betsy.
Okay. You were saying a little bit ago about the two meanings of a land flowing with milk and honey.
Right.
And then they will eat curds,
And honey.
And honey. Well, if you're eating them, like you said, but if if it's flowing, you have an abundance. Because you're eating other things. There's lots of other things to eat, so you have I mean, it just kind of made sense then that would make sense. That there was lots of it.
Yeah.
Just a little.
Yes. And I was noticing something here too that was about that curds and honey stuff. It was in the end of chapter 7. It was right after, okay, so they're talking about the king of Assyria coming in 18. I think, Tammy, you read that. The Lord will whistle for the fly to come and for the bee to come. They'll come and settle. And then I have the one about, in that day the Lord will shave with a razor, a hired razor, Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet. And in the NIV it says, going to shave your legs. Like, well, that sounds kind of funny. Like that was a horrible thing. Oh, I'm going to shave your legs. But I think it's referring to men. I don't know that women shaved their legs back then. They probably didn't. But I had to laugh at that. This is a sign of God's horror. There's going to be judgment coming from them. They're going to come and shave your legs. Like, okay, that's a weird way to say my judgment's coming. But look what it says next. Verse 21. In that day, a man will keep alive a young cow and 2 sheep. And because of the abundance of milk that they give, he will eat curds. For everyone who is left in the land will eat curds and honey. Again, it sounds there like kind of a good thing. But again, in the statement of judgment, it's not. It's like that's all they have. The foreign invasion would cause a change from an agricultural economy to a pastoral one. Not enough men would remain in the land to farm. It was to be a time of great poverty, is John MacArthur's note. So, yeah. Microphone?
Just a thought about the shaving is, the beard and the hair on your head and even on your legs, I suppose, is somewhat of a sign of masculinity. And they're going to be shaved. They're going to be left bare. They're going to be left exposed.
There's great shame in that. Yeah.
Shame, yeah.
Yeah, well, and there's others. Women had to shave their heads sometimes as a sign of shame. The soldiers that, I don't remember which king, sent out some soldiers, emissaries to go to this other country, and the guy shaved off their beards, and who was it? David sent some. Yeah. They heavily insulted them. Yes, and cut off half their garment on the backside and stuff. And he told them, stay in this city. They just barely got into the nation of Israel, got back in their home. He said, stay there until your beards grow back and everything's fine again, then come on home. Yeah, great shame in shaving. I shave. I guess it's different in our context. I don't shave my legs. Yeah. Well, maybe we're getting a little too silly. Maybe we better just stop there. But no, thanks for your input. Interesting chapters. We kind of hit highlights and followed his progression. But there's some interesting stuff tucked in there. So, yeah. God bless you as you continue to hear from Isaiah at home. And thank you for your input tonight.